Well, I'd like you to turn back with me this morning, if you will, to Matthew 17. We've previously considered in this chapter the transfiguration, that there is an unveiling as the chapter starts, and that unveiling involves seeing Christ in his glory. Verse 2 of chapter 17, he was transfigured before them. That is the word that we use for the change from a caterpillar to a butterfly, as there is metamorphosis. And that remarkable transition is something that it's very hard to explain or understand in any sense in which pure chance is involved, because if you look on the BBC website, there's a lovely video of the X-ray of a crystallography of a cocoon, and literally the whole of the original caterpillar almost dissolves. There is what I think technically would be known as gunk in that chrysalis or cocoon, and eventually that most beautiful butterfly comes forth. Well, how that can happen by pure random chance without design is almost unbelievable. So there is transfiguration, and we're told his face shone like the sun and his clothes became white as the light. Just the three disciples seeing Christ in his glory, seeing Christ in his splendor, something that was reserved from the 9 other disciples, but Peter, James and John see. And the voice from heaven and the testimony of Elijah and Moses, in accordance with that last chapter of the Old Testament, that Elijah would come first, and that Moses also in Malachi chapter 4. And then we saw the failure of the disciples when there'd been this man whose son was demon possessed, and in verse 16 of Matthew 17, I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. There was a limit to the commission the apostles had been given. The apostles were commissioned to the casting out of spirits, of demons, but that was not a carte blanche commission. It was a commission that was limited. And here we see some of the limits. And we see, whilst Christ himself is able to cast the demon out, rebuke the demon, and the child was cured from that very hour, so the disciples could not. And they needed to come to prayer and fasting, as verse 21 would tell us. Well, we come to this latter portion of Matthew 17 now, from verse 22 to 27. And we find, firstly, the repetition of the message that Jesus Christ is going to be betrayed, killed, and raised up. You know, it is a unique message of the Christian gospel that these things happen to the one who is not only the only perfect human being who has ever been born on the face of this planet, but also the man who is at the same time God, the one whom we may describe as the God-man. As God, he cannot suffer, but in his person, he suffers in his humanity. And there are 3 essential elements of what Jesus tells his disciples. And I would suggest to you that the reaction of the disciples in the 23rd verse makes it plain that they do not really understand what Jesus is saying. Here we are well into the second year now of into the last year, the final year of Jesus' ministry, the third year. They've completed 2 years of his ministry. They're into the third year. And the disciples really are familiar with Christ, but they do not seem to take on board what he is telling them. And we should be therefore encouraged when we ourselves make slow progress as Christians. Perhaps some of us who've been Christians for many years feel how little progress we've made, feel how often we've failed to do as well as we might in the service we've rendered to God, indeed in the devotion that we render to God. But the disciples are the same. They had the benefit of being with Jesus in the flesh. But Jesus tells them, firstly, that he is about to be betrayed. Remember that he's addressing his disciples. He's telling that group of 12. That group of 12 includes the one who will betray him. It's a most salutary thought. But then he tells them that following that betrayal, he will be killed. Sometimes people say, oh, well, perhaps Judas thought that if he betrayed Christ, he would actually push Christ, force Christ into taking on a kingdom, becoming the leader that the Jews were looking for, becoming the king who would re-establish Israel as a nation, and a nation to which all the other nations paid tribute, and indeed remove the Roman Empire from its jurisdiction over Israel. But Jesus here, in the hearing of Judas, we would believe, makes it plain that that is not going to happen. Judas should have known that his betrayal would not serve to, as it were, encourage Jesus to establish a kingdom on this earth. Jesus is making it plain that there is to be a kingdom of a different nature. They will kill him, and the third day he will be raised up. There are Anglican bishops you can look to who don't understand the resurrection, who tell you the resurrection is something spiritual only. The reality is that the resurrection, Jesus Christ rises from the dead in a physical body. A body that can eat, as you look at the last chapter of John's Gospel. A body that can pass through solid walls. A body that is, a body still bearing the marks of crucifixion. But notice too the emphasis upon the third day. If you do a study and look, perhaps with a computer concordance, at the Old Testament and the number of times different days of the week are mentioned, you discover that obviously the Sabbath day, the seventh day, is mentioned very many times, but actually disproportionately mentioned is the third day, because God is emphasizing to us that something hugely significant was going to happen on the third day. And all the way through the Old Testament that trust comes. But the reaction of the disciples, they were exceedingly sorrowful. They don't take encouragement from the fact that Jesus is going to be raised up. Rather, they are sorrowful at the idea that he will be killed. They haven't yet properly understood. We mustn't be surprised, and we must be patient with people who are slow to come to an understanding of what the Bible teaches. We mustn't be surprised when people take a long time to that understanding. Well, we come then to this last section of Matthew 17, and it's an interesting section. And I want to take you back for a moment to Exodus chapter 30, where we read a little earlier in our service, because even though the ransom money, as it's titled in our New King James Version here, was for every male, the half shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary, was going to be used for the running of the tabernacle, for the administration of the tabernacle and all the services and expenses of that. But even here, probably 1500 years before Jesus would come, even here there is already a looking to the very time when Jesus would come. Even here there is in the mind of God that understanding that the Lord Jesus Christ will be faced with the dilemma or the question, does he pay the temple tax or not? Every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord. Well, of course, every human being born has been born with a fallen nature. Every human being born has been born under a curse. Adam and Eve, not born but created perfect, but then bringing a curse upon themselves by their conduct. Christ alone is the only one who by legal title and right would have been exempt from this tax. Look at what Jesus says. Turn back now to Matthew 17 verse 26 or 25 and 26, where he says to Simon, "What do you think? From whom do the kings of the earth take custom or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" And Peter answered, and Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free." Jesus is saying there's no obligation upon me as the Son of God, the eternal Logos of God, the Word of God, incarnate. There's no obligation upon me to pay the temple tax. However, let's just work through this in order from verse 24. Notice, firstly, that the people who are collecting the temple tax, don't have the courage to come to Christ. Again and again, you find people coming to the disciples in order to try to get to Christ or to try to understand. Those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" Here is Peter put on a spot. And Peter acts, it would be reasonable to say, rashly. He assumes that Christ would pay the temple tax. Here is Peter, who has himself understood of Christ, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He has made that great confession. He's spoken of the uniqueness of Christ, and yet now he blends Christ into the whole sum of the male population of Israel. He doesn't realize the uniqueness of Christ in this aspect. And Jesus, of course, in his divinity, knows all that has been unfolding and asks the question that I've already referred to. And Peter receives a strange commission, and it is because, nevertheless, lest we offend them, lest we cause difficulty, lest we cause unnecessary disturbance. That's a good rule. We don't always need to be going around insisting that we, as it were, put people's noses out of joint. Jesus here, lest we offend them. Is that a rule that we apply in our ordinary life? Do we apply that rule to avoid unnecessary strife, unnecessary contention? But I want to suggest to you that what Jesus says is utterly remarkable. And notice too that from this he cuts out Judas. In the ordinary way, Judas held the money bag. In the ordinary way, what was given to Christ went into that money bag, and Judas supposedly administered it. He actually, of course, himself was a thief, was taking somewhat from that money bag as he was able. But notice, it's as if there's a deliberate coming back to verse 22. Because Judas is cut out from this process. He doesn't say to Peter, "Go to Judas, ask him for the coin that will pay the temple tax for the two of us." He simply asks Peter to use his fisherman's skills. And not even as he does on at least two particular occasions. You remember when in the first instance he says to Peter, "Let down your nets." And Peter says, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And depending on the translation you use, be aware that probably the best rendering there of the original and the best original text is probably the rendering that says, "Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." Because Peter is actually reducing his obedience to the least possible, the least he can get away with, the least that will save face. Christ has told him, let down the nets. He says, I will let down the net at your word. He's saving face. Sometimes as Christians we save face. We attend a meeting. There's part of us that doesn't really want to, that would rather be somewhere else. And yet we save face spiritually. It applies in lots of areas of life, but it can apply in our Christian life also. And Peter is there and let down the nets. And then you remember in that last chapter of John's Gospel how Peter is going fishing, or the penultimate chapter, and Jesus appears on the beach, and again they let down the net, and there are 153 fish in the net. But it's a remarkable series of providences, a remarkable series of coincidences, we might say. Firstly, Peter has to go to the sea. He's been rash in committing Christ to pay the temple tax, but now he does exactly what Jesus tells him. Go to the sea. Then cast in a hook. You don't have to go very far in Falmouth to see certainly younger people, children, perhaps with a crab line or something from one of the wharfs, and they're simply hoping that something will bite on the hook. Cast in a hook. When you cast in a net, you're indiscriminately gathering a number of fish potentially. When you put in a hook, you're only going to take one fish at a time. And that's exactly what Peter's going to do. It's not normally what he does, but he takes the fish that comes up first. And you have to open the mouth of the fish because you have to take out the hook. And remarkably, there will be just that amount of money. That is such an incredible sequence. But it should encourage us to know that whatever is unfolding in our life is not out of control. God is in control. There's a hymn that tells us sovereign ruler of the skies. And the hymn, based upon a psalm, tells us not a single shaft can hit, not a single arrow or javelin could hit, till the God of love sees fit. And it is a wonderful hymn, and it's a hymn that reminds us that God designs in his love all that is unfolding. And 1,000 may fall at your side, but you will not fall till God in love sees that it is right. And we can take great encouragement from the way in which God rules in providence over all that unfolds. You find some Christians who are seemingly so enthusiastic they always want to be looking for something miraculous. There have been some tragic incidents where people have felt that they've been healed and refused to go to a doctor and then tragically died, having supposedly claimed miraculous healings and similar things. We have to be very cautious with these things, but we can take comfort in the fact that whilst God is able to grant remarkable and miraculous healing, whilst God is able to grant that sort of healing, incidentally, even when God works in a remarkable fashion and answers prayer for healing or some similar thing, in general, it is not going to be the sort of healing as when Christ dealt with someone who is maimed and the regrowing of a limb. That's something that we don't usually associate with things today. But God works in response to believing prayer, and God heals and God answers those prayers. And he is at work in providence. But we so often fail to see providence. Sometimes it is science that hides providence because we think we understand the mechanisms, we think we understand the reasoning why something happens. And so with the weather. we don't see that weather is coming from the hand of God, that God is directing. Just for a moment, let me take you back to those concluding chapters of Job, where Job, perhaps living just after the flood, in a time when perhaps there are still the remnants of the flood, in the waters receding, in the ice age that perhaps may have come after the flood. And Job, as he listens to God, is to recognize that it is God who sends these different things. It is perhaps a relic of the judgment in a human sense. It is a relic of the change that has happened in the climate of the world because of the flood. But just taking, for example, Job 38, verse 22, have you entered the treasury of snow? Or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered of the earth? When we see a rainbow, we take it for granted, but it is God who in providence is ordaining that the light is diffused. Has the rain a father, verse 28, who has begotten the drops of dew, from whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? You see, we hear the weather forecast, and if you use a weather forecast on your phone, listen, I laugh, because we have almost identical phones, and the two forecasts are different. And then you look at the BBC site, and you look at the weather site at Exeter, and you find again they're different. Exeter has these supercomputers, but it's not always right. Well, we tend to think, well, we're working in a scientific basis, but we forget it is God who does these things. Verse 34 of Job 38, can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Well, clearly someone did this morning when we all came into this assembly. But the point I'm making is that even these things are under the control of God. And it's so easy to imagine that because we understand something of the materialistic process, we forget that God is in providence controlling all that unfolds. Friends, everything that is unfolding in your life ultimately is under the providential care of God. And if you're a believer, that providential care is heading in the direction of conforming you to the life of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the image of his glory, conforming you and shaping you and moulding you to that image. And if you're not a believer, then God is dealing with you in a way to show you the wonder of the gospel, to show you the marvel of his love, to show you that there is a glory to be known, a glory to be sought, and that glory is something lasting and eternal, and not something transient and passing. So many people are living only for what is transient and passing. That's all they're concerned with. But the wise person seeks that which is eternal. Well, let's close by singing together 501 from our hymn books, and we sing to the glory of God, sovereign grace, or sin abounding. 501.